to President Trump and leaders of the world. We stand on the edge of a repeating 100-year environmental cycle, one that has manifested throughout history, seen in the 1730s, the 1830s, and the 1930s, each time marking a period of extreme weather and agricultural collapse. The 2030s are set to follow this same pattern. However, the current environmental damage, particularly due to the Fukushima disaster and BP oil spill, will likely amplify the impact, making this cycle far more intense than before. The following outlines what we can expect year by year in the 2030s and shows how these patterns match previous centuries. But crucially, this cycle is not being openly discussed, and instead the narrative of climate change is being used to place the blame solely on human actions. This is a critical moment for us to prepare properly and recognize that this pattern is not new and that our response needs to be timely and informed. 2030, early drought and heat. Example from the 1730s. In 1730, Europe saw the beginning of a long period of intense drought and heat waves, which spread across the continent. These conditions were part of a broader cooling trend in the global climate that led to crop failures and economic hardship. Example from the 1830s. In 1830, America faced early drought conditions. The Mississippi Valley in the Southwest saw reduced rainfall, which led to the early stages of what would become a decade-long struggle with drought, famine, and migration. Example from the 1930s. 1930 marked the early stages of the Dust Bowl, with dry conditions affecting the Midwest, Great Plains, and parts of California. The year 1930 began a decade-long period of heat waves and droughts that would worsen with each passing year. 2030's impact. Expect early signs of drought and heat waves in the Southwest and California, affecting crops and water supplies. Early warnings of heat anomalies will be felt across Texas and the Midwest. Tatterhouse 2031, intensifying conditions. Example from the 1730s. In 1731, intense heat and drought hit China and Europe, causing agricultural distress and social unrest. The Southwest U.S. began to see longer dry spells, contributing to poor crop yields and food shortages. Example from the 1830s. By 1831, the conditions worsened in North America, leading to crop failures in parts of the Midwest. Some areas began to see large-scale migration as a result of water scarcity. Example from the 1930s. By 1931, the Dust Bowl conditions started to affect large swaths of the Great Plains. Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas experienced the beginning of severe dust storms and heat extremes. The 2030s impact. 2031 will likely bring increased drought and intense heat, especially in the Great Plains and Midwest. Water shortages will begin to strain the agriculture in these regions, and wildfires will become a growing concern in the Southwest. 2032, full drought grip. Example from the 1730s. In 1732, continued dry spells across Europe and the Middle East led to famine. This year was part of a larger decade of famine caused by severe drought. Example from the 1830s. The 1832 drought was particularly devastating in the Mississippi River Valley and Southwest, contributing to crop failures and economic hardship. Example from the 1930s. In 1932, dust storms and extreme heat began to reach their peak, especially in the Great Plains, where vast areas of farmland were completely destroyed by the Dust Bowl. 2030's impact. By 2032, drought will reach its worst in North America, especially in the Southwest and California, leading to mass migration from farming regions. The heat wave and dry conditions will also push many agricultural regions to their limits, leading to widespread food insecurity. 2033, agricultural collapse. Example from the 1730s. In 1733, Europe's agricultural crisis worsened, leading to severe famine in several countries, particularly in France, where grain harvests failed. Example from the 1830s. By 1833, the Mississippi Valley and Southwest U.S. were severely affected by drought, with heat waves pushing the Mississippi River to record low levels, straining transportation and agriculture. Example from the 1930s. The Dust Bowl hit its worst point in 1933, with severe dust storms and heat impacting the Midwest. By this point, the farmers in the region were devastated, unable to grow crops. 2030's impact. By 2033, agricultural collapse will be a central issue, especially in the Great Plains and California, with food scarcity becoming more prominent across the U.S. This could push both migration and resource competition to dangerous levels. 2034 and 35, crisis point. Example from the 1730s. In 1734, Europe's agricultural crisis worsened, leading to severe famine in several countries, particularly in France, where grain harvests failed. Example from the 1830s. The 1834 drought continued to devastate the Midwest and Southwest, with heat waves pushing the Mississippi River to record low levels, straining transportation and agriculture. Example from the 1930s. By 1934, the Dust Bowl reached its most intense stage, with dust storms destroying crops and wildfires becoming a massive threat. The agricultural collapse reached a crisis point. 2030's impact. By 2034, we will likely see the worst of the drought and heat in North America. Agricultural failure, dust storms, and wildfires will wreak havoc across the Southwest, California, and Great Plains, causing mass displacement. 2036-2039, long-term instability. Example from the 1730s. By the late 1730s, parts of Europe and China were still grappling with the effects of prolonged drought and crop failure, leading to economic collapse in certain regions. Example from the 1830s. The early 1830s saw sporadic droughts in the Mississippi Valley and Southwest U.S., with food scarcity and economic hardship lingering until the end of the decade. Example from the 1930s. By 1939, while the Dust Bowl had lessened, much of the Great Plains remained severely affected. The region's recovery was slow and uneven, leaving long-term scars on the agricultural economy. To 2030's impact. The late 2030s will likely bring a slow recovery from the droughts and heat waves that devastated much of North America. It will take years for certain regions to rebuild, and the agricultural systems in California and the Great Plains may be permanently altered. Compounding effects of Fukushima and BP. The Fukushima disaster in 2011 and the BP oil spill in 2010 have dramatically altered the state of the environment, making these cyclical events far more intense. The Fukushima radiation affected the Pacific Ocean, which in turn impacts weather patterns and oceanic temperatures. Coupled with damage to the Gulf Stream due to the BP oil spill, these factors will likely contribute to a more extreme version of the 1930s-like conditions. These disasters are ongoing, and their effects may intensify during this 2030s period, further disrupting the climate system and leading to unpredictable weather patterns that could dramatically worsen the already intense droughts, heat waves, and storms. Urgency for action. The 2030s will not be just another natural event. It will be a repeated pattern of extreme weather, exacerbated by human actions that have left the planet in a fragile state. To avoid catastrophic loss of life and economic collapse, it is crucial for those in positions of power to prepare for this cycle, to support migration plans, food and water security, and regional recovery strategies. This is not just a matter of climate change, but the natural recurring cycles that history has shown us. This cycle is not new and should not be blamed solely on human activity. Instead, understanding the cyclical nature of these events will provide a clearer path to mitigation and preparation for all. P.S. As we look to the 2030s, it's also important to consider the celestial and seismic events that marked the previous cycles. In the 1830s, a meteor shower, often referred to as the Great Meteor Shower of 1833, occurred, where stars seemed to fall from the sky, creating widespread fear and awe across North America. This event is often remembered as a celestial omen, with its intensity mirroring the extreme conditions on Earth. Additionally, the 1830s saw earthquakes and volcanic activity that rattled regions like the New Madrid seismic zone, which affected parts of the Mississippi Valley. The 1930s, similarly, was not only marked by the Dust Bowl and severe droughts, but also by intense earthquakes, like the 1935 tectonic earthquake in the Alaska region, which caused significant damage and highlighted the tectonic instability. Solar activity during this time also may have contributed to abnormal weather patterns, compounding the ongoing environmental crises. Given these precedents, the 2030s may very well see a return of similar celestial events, where meteors, solar flares, and even earthquakes could coincide with the ongoing climatic shifts. The intensity of these events, be it in the sky or on Earth, might feel more pronounced as historical patterns repeat themselves. The celestial disturbances, alongside earthquakes and volcanic activity, may add to the uncertainty of the decade, amplifying the sense of chaos and global crisis that humanity may face. PSS. Looking at the cycles through the 1730s, 1830s, and 1930s, we see an interesting pattern of increasing intensity, much like the progression of birth pangs. In the 1730s, the intensity wasn't as severe, but it marked the beginning of a trend. By the 1830s, the conditions worsened, with extreme weather events and noticeable celestial occurrences. The 1930s took that intensity to a whole new level, with the Dust Bowl and severe droughts wreaking havoc on North America. Each decade built upon the one before it, escalating in a parabolic way, much like how the intensity of labor pains increases as the moment of birth approaches. The 2030s could very well represent the peak of these increasing cycles, potentially the most intense of all. Given the compounded environmental damage, including the Fukushima disaster and the BP oil spill, the 2030s might see an even greater escalation. Just as labor pains intensify, leading to the moment of birth, the 2030s could bring the hardest challenges yet. Now is the time to prepare, as this increased intensity seems inevitable.